The countryside just outside Willow Crest City was a place of quiet beauty. Rolling fields stretched endlessly, dotted with clusters of trees that whispered softly in the breeze. At the far edge of this serene expanse stood a sprawling estate, hidden behind tall hedges and a simple iron gate. The estate belonged to Thomas Gray, a man as enigmatic as the land he called home. Thomas had lived on the outskirts of society for over a decade, cultivating a life of seclusion. His two-story house was flanked by a thriving mini-farm and greenhouses bursting with lush produce. A tranquil pond glimmered nearby, where he bred fish, adding to his self-sufficient way of living. Wealthy beyond imagination, Thomas could have owned luxury mansions or mingled in the upper echelons of society. Instead, he chose solitude, pouring his resources into his land and his projects, far away from the city's demands. His life had been carefully constructed to avoid the pain that came with human connection. At 45, Thomas carried a quiet weight in his piercing blue eyes, a depth that hinted at unresolved grief. He rarely left his estate and preferred the company of his plants and animals over people. To those who knew him, he was a man of few words but boundless kindness, always ready to help yet fiercely private. 15 miles away, in the bustling heart of the city, Amelia Grant was juggling the chaos of a party she had been planning for weeks. It was her 10th wedding anniversary, and she had spared no effort in organizing a lavish celebration. A former event planner, Amelia had an eye for detail, and her brownstone home gleamed with elegant decorations, fairy lights, and a table laden with food. Yet, beneath her cheery exterior, Amelia felt a pang of unease. The past year had been tough on her marriage to Michael, a kind but often distant man who buried himself in work. She had hoped this party would rekindle some of the joy they'd shared in their early years together. As the guests began to arrive, Amelia forced herself to smile and greet each one warmly. Her husband mingled easily, his laughter carrying over the chatter of their friends. It was the first time in months that they had been surrounded by people who cared about them, and Amelia prayed the evening would bring them closer. Among the guests was Thomas, an unlikely attendee. Amelia had persuaded Michael to invite him, knowing how reclusive Thomas was, but hoping the gesture would mean something. When he arrived, wearing a simple blazer over a crisp shirt, his rugged appearance drew curious glances. Though Thomas had known Michael for years, most of the guests had never met him, and his quiet demeanor stood in stark contrast to the lively crowd. Amelia introduced him to a few people, but Thomas quickly retreated to a small table in the corner, where he sipped his drink and observed the party with a faint, detached smile. Despite his best efforts to blend in, his presence had an undeniable pull. His air of mystery and quiet confidence made him intriguing, especially to Amelia's friends. From across the room, Amelia noticed her closest friends whispering and stealing glances at Thomas. Lila, her outspoken childhood friend, leaned closer to her. "Who is that man sitting by himself?" "That's Thomas," Amelia replied, lowering her voice. "Michael's best friend." Lila's eyebrows shot up. "That's the famous Recluse? The one with the greenhouse and the pond? He looks like something out of a movie." Amelia chuckled nervously. "He's a good guy, just private." But Lila wasn't the only one captivated. Soon, 3 more women had gathered near Thomas's table, finding excuses to strike up conversations with him. Thomas, ever polite, nodded and answered their questions briefly, but it was clear he wasn't comfortable under their attention. Amelia winced. Why did I tell them about him? As the evening wore on, Thomas's discomfort grew. After an hour, he stood, thanked Amelia and Michael for the invitation, and quietly excused himself. Amelia watched him leave, guilt gnawing at her. The women who had surrounded him looked disappointed, their curiosity unsatisfied. Later, as the party wound down, Amelia's friends peppered her with questions. "Is he single?" Lila asked, her tone eager. "Does he ever come into the city?" chimed another. "Can you introduce us properly next time?" Amelia forced a smile, deflecting their questions. But deep down, she regretted bringing Thomas into the spotlight. She had wanted him to feel welcome, but instead, he had been put on display, his privacy invaded in a way she knew he wouldn't appreciate. That night, as Amelia tidied up the remnants of the party, Michael approached her. "You okay?" she sighed, setting down a glass. "I think I embarrassed Thomas tonight." He didn't say anything, but I could tell he wasn't comfortable. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thomas doesn't hold grudges. But you're right, he doesn't like attention." "I didn't mean to cause him any trouble," she said softly. "I just thought maybe he could use some company." Michael's gaze softened. "You have a big heart, Amelia. That's why he came. For you." Her chest tightened at the unexpected kindness in her husband's words. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "I hope he's okay." As the night grew quiet, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Thomas's story than she understood. His quiet sadness, his decision to live alone. She sensed it came from a place of deep loss. And though she didn't know it yet, her curiosity would soon lead to a discovery that would change all their lives forever. The days following the anniversary party were uneventful, but Amelia couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. She felt a growing sense of guilt for having drawn unwanted attention to him. Her friends' endless questions about him had only made her regret her decision more. One afternoon, while Michael was at work, Amelia decided to call Thomas. The phone rang twice before his calm voice answered. "Hello." "Hi, Thomas. It's Amelia," she began, hesitating. "I wanted to thank you for coming to the party. I know it's not really your thing, and I'm sorry if it was uncomfortable." There was a long pause before Thomas spoke. "You don't need to apologize. It was nice to see you and Michael." She exhaled, relieved. "I'm glad. I just wanted to check in. I know the girls. They were a bit much." A faint chuckle came through the phone, surprising her. "They were enthusiastic," he admitted. "But I'm used to keeping to myself. It was a bit overwhelming." Amelia smiled, encouraged by his candor. "Maybe next time we can meet up in a quieter setting. Just us." There was another pause, and then his voice softened. "I'd like that." The following weekend, Amelia drove out to Thomas's estate. The iron gate swung open as she approached, revealing a gravel path lined with tall trees. She parked near the house and stepped out, taking in the serene beauty of the property. The pond shimmered in the sunlight, and the greenhouse glowed with life. It was a world away from the hustle of the city. Thomas emerged from the house, dressed simply in jeans and a button-down shirt. His expression was as reserved as ever, but there was a faint warmth in his eyes as he greeted her. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for inviting me," Amelia replied, following him toward the greenhouse. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of herbs and flowers. Rows of vibrant plants stretched out before her, meticulously cared for. Thomas explained each section with quiet pride, his voice steady and thoughtful. "This is amazing," Amelia said, marveling at the variety. "You've created something really special here." Thomas gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "It keeps me busy, and it's peaceful." They walked along the rows, the silence between them comfortable. But as they moved further into the greenhouse, Amelia's curiosity bubbled to the surface. "Thomas," she began cautiously, "I've always wondered, why do you live out here all alone? You have all this wealth, but you don't seem to use it the way most people would." His steps faltered slightly, and she immediately regretted asking. But then he stopped and turned to face her, his gaze distant. "Because the things that matter to me can't be bought," he said quietly. "And because I've lost enough to know that some connections come at too high a cost." Amelia's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's okay," he said after a moment. "I've just learned to be careful. People see the money before they see me. It's easier to stay out here, away from all that." Amelia nodded, understanding more than she had expected. She saw in Thomas a reflection of her own struggles. His isolation, though self-imposed, mirrored the loneliness she sometimes felt even in a crowd. Over the next few weeks, Amelia and Thomas began to meet regularly. Sometimes she would bring fresh bread or pastries, and they would talk about everything from gardening to books. She saw glimpses of the man behind the quiet facade, a man who had a sharp wit, a thoughtful mind, and a deep capacity for kindness. One day, as they sat by the pond, Thomas shared a memory that left Amelia speechless. "I wasn't always alone," he said, his voice low. "I was married once. Her name was Claire." Amelia turned to him, her breath catching. "What happened?" "She passed away," he said simply, his eyes fixed on the water. "It was sudden, an accident. I thought I could keep going, but everything felt hollow without her. So I left the city, built this place. It was the only way I could find peace." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she listened. "Thomas, I'm so sorry." He nodded, his face unreadable. "It's been years, but some losses don't fade. They just become part of who you are." Amelia placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but steady. "Thank you for telling me. I know that wasn't easy." He gave her a small, grateful smile. "You're one of the few people I feel I can trust." That evening, as Amelia drove back to the city, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She thought about the secrets Thomas had carried, the pain he had endured in silence. And she thought about her own life, the cracks in her marriage, the sense that something was missing. She realized that, despite his wealth and reclusive lifestyle, Thomas had given her something she hadn't expected, a sense of connection. And though she couldn't explain why, she felt that their friendship was about to lead to something far greater than either of them could anticipate. A month after their visit by the pond, Amelia hosted a small dinner party at her home, one far more intimate than her wedding anniversary gathering. Michael suggested inviting Thomas, recognizing how much his friend seemed to enjoy spending time with Amelia. Though hesitant, Thomas agreed, with the condition that it remain a low-key affair. The evening began quietly, the guests, a few close friends of Amelia and Michael, chatting easily over wine and appetizers. Thomas arrived a little late, carrying a small basket of fresh produce from his farm as a gift. Amelia greeted him warmly, guiding him into the cozy dining room. "This is perfect," she said, smiling. "Thank you for coming." Thomas gave a polite nod. "Thank you for inviting me." As the dinner unfolded, Amelia noticed how easily Thomas blended into the conversation. He was reserved but thoughtful, offering insights about sustainable farming and sharing the occasional dry joke that earned genuine laughter. Even Michael seemed lighter in his presence, the tension that sometimes lingered between him and Amelia momentarily forgotten. It wasn't until dessert that the conversation took an unexpected turn. Lila, who had been at the anniversary party, couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "So, Thomas," she said, her tone playful but probing, "what's it like living out there all alone? You're like a real-life mystery novel." Amelia shot her a warning look, but Thomas didn't flinch. He set down his fork and met Lila's gaze evenly. "It's peaceful," he said simply, "and it gives me time to focus on what matters." "And what matters?" Lila pressed, leaning forward. "Surely someone like you, successful, self-sufficient, must get lonely?" Amelia bristled, ready to intervene, but Thomas spoke first. "What matters," he said, his voice steady, "is living a life that feels honest. After losing my wife, I realized how much of my life was built on appearances. I wanted something real, something that didn't depend on wealth or status." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the table. Lila sat back, chastened, while the other guests exchanged glances. Amelia felt a swell of admiration for Thomas, his vulnerability cutting through the trivial chatter. Later that night, as the guests trickled out, Thomas lingered in the living room. Amelia walked him to the door, her heart heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "I know that wasn't easy." "It wasn't as bad as I expected," he admitted, a faint smile touching his lips. "Your friends are persistent, but kind." She chuckled, then hesitated. "Thomas, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever think about leaving the estate? Coming back to the city? Being around people again?" His expression grew thoughtful, his gaze distant. I've thought about it, but every time, I wonder if I'd lose the peace I've worked so hard to find. Amelia nodded, understanding his hesitation. But don't you think there's peace in connection too? In letting people in? He met her eyes, something unspoken passing between them. Maybe, but it's not easy to trust again. It's worth it, she said quietly. I think you'd be surprised how much people care about you, not what you have. Thomas smiled, the warmth in it genuine. You've given me a lot to think about, Amelia. Thank you. The weeks that followed brought subtle but significant changes. Thomas began venturing into the city more frequently, often meeting Amelia for coffee or a quiet lunch. He even joined Michael for a basketball game, their easy camaraderie reminding Amelia of the bond they once shared. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Thomas stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on the children playing nearby. You know, he said, his voice tinged with wonder. I used to think I'd never want this again. People, relationships, the risk of loss. But maybe I've been wrong. Amelia smiled, her heart swelling with pride for him. You're allowed to change your mind. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. He turned to her, gratitude shining in his eyes. You've helped me see that. I don't think I could have done it without you. Months later, on a warm spring evening, Amelia and Michael hosted another gathering, this time at Thomas's estate. It was a celebration of renewal, a chance for Thomas to share the life he had so carefully built with those who cared for him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the guests wandered the gardens, marveling at the beauty and tranquility of the property. Thomas, once so guarded, moved easily among them, his smile genuine, his laughter unforced. Amelia watched from the porch, her chest tight with emotion. Michael joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. You did this, you know, he said. She shook her head. No, he did. He just needed someone to remind him he wasn't alone. As the evening wore on, Amelia caught Thomas's eye from across the garden. He raised his glass in a silent toast, his expression filled with gratitude. She smiled, lifting her own glass in return. In that moment, she knew that their lives had become intertwined in a way none of them had expected. Through loss and pain, they had found connection. Through redemption, they had found hope. And as the stars began to appear overhead, the quiet strength of their bond shone brighter than ever, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path to light.